But the reality is the movements that you see inside the box are oftentimes going to challenge your upper body to push and pull together in workouts. So make sure that you pair them together, especially as you are getting close to competition, to expose some of these limitations that we've talked about and raise your overall ceiling. If you get your Metcons good, you get your Olympic lifting good, you get all your machines better, but you neglect this type of test, you could have tons of fitness that gets blocked by just having grip limitations in this pairing. Or you have tons of fitness, but when you hold your arms overhead, you can't breathe, so you get excessively gassed in this type of pairing. And in a testing format where you only have 3 to 5 tests, if 1 to 2 of them are going to test this limitation and you didn't train it, you're basically giving away like half of your overall points by just not having prepared correctly. All right, everybody, welcome back to the whiteboard. Today we are going to talk about a movement pairing, pushing and pulling, which I think is one of these hidden in plain sight movement pairings that really crush people when it comes to competing in CrossFit. A lot of people, and this is a story that has played out throughout the course of my career as a coach in this space, will do all the things in their off season. They'll improve their 2K row, they'll improve their 5K run, they'll do burpees out the wazoo so they feel like their breathing is up. They'll train all their skills, and they'll do Metcons regularly, generally with variance, and they'll feel super confident going into the open. Then the open comes, and a certain type of test that pairs upper body pulling and upper body pushing together in super high volumes for like the entire workout, where you're basically having to either hold your arms overhead or hold on to an implement and grip, will come out and it will wreck them on the leaderboard. And they'll question everything they did in their off season. They'll question why they didn't get better or why they sucked at this test. And I think sometimes this is just an area of training that people don't really prioritize enough based on how much it is tested in the sport. So today we're going to talk about some of the data to reinforce what I'm saying about the importance of this combination. We'll talk about what those limitations are and how they're exposed in the body. And then most importantly, I'll give you a framework for training that so that at least hopefully this season or next season or for your entire career in mixed modal training, you'll feel like at least this pairing is something that you can master at a little bit of a higher level, so that way you can do better on the leaderboards. So let's jump into the data. So this combination, when I say push and pull, is basically taking what I thought about are all the movements that come out in the common CrossFit Open or online qualifier format that require first upper body pulling. So obviously the straight arm ones like toes to bar or hanging from the bar and doing chest to bars, or hanging from the rings and doing muscle ups, which is kind of a pairing of a pull and a push in one movement. And then with those movements being selected in the workout, you also then take an upper body push and pair that together. So I counted burpees, even though it's more of a horizontal push, wall walks, handstand push-ups, shoulder to overhead in any capacity, overhead squats where you're having to hold straight arm strength overhead. And when you pair those two things together, that is what I'm calling push and pull. So it doesn't mean the entire workout is comprised of these, but it means that a huge bulk of the workout is pairing and going back and forth between upper body push and upper body pull. And that's very unique to the sport. Like High Rocks, for example, tests your overall cardiorespiratory fitness. But if you look at the actual distribution of work, there's not that much overall stress emphasized on your upper body pushing and pressing muscles. It's much more your legs and hips being able to keep you running, cardiovascular system to keep pumping, but it's a very different type of stimulus that limits people when it comes to qualifiers. So what I did was looked at the last 6 years of data in the Open. So from 2020 to 2025. And you could maybe make some arguments on some of these workouts not being fully push-pull, and you could also make arguments on some of the workouts that I excluded actually being push-pull. But in 2020, there were 2 tests, 2021, 1 test, 2022, 1 test, and then from 2023 to 2025, there were 2 tests in each one of those Opens that had this theme of pushing and pulling combined within it. Now, some of these years were 5-year opens, some of them were 3-year opens, but when you do the math on all of the tests in the open and you divide in these, it means that 40%, so almost half of the total testing body, is this stimulus of pairing your upper body pushing and pulling muscles in super high volumes in a test. So just based on that fact, when you are writing your training or doing your training or looking at your training, as you are getting close to the open or close to a competitive setting, you need to make sure that a big portion of your training is addressing this, because it's almost half the testing body. Half of your scores are based on your ability in one thing, then your overall placing on a leaderboard is largely going to be weighted on being good at that thing. So hopefully it starts with why. This is why we're talking about this concept, because it's so important and it crushes people. I don't think they really realize why it's so different. So if you feel confident in all of your Metcons, like something comes up randomly on the board in your gym and the program you're following, and it's a normal Metcon, and you go into it and you feel like you're crushing it, but this specific combo comes up and it crushes you, let's talk about why that potentially could be the case and then what you can do about it. So right here, I have kind of two of my amazing whiteboard illustrations of a guy holding a barbell, or a girl holding a barbell overhead and then hanging from a bar overhead. And what I drew these for was not necessarily to say that all of these push-pull combos have to be overhead, but a lot of them in the sport do require your arms to be over your head for really long periods of time. You might be going back and forth from jerks to toes to bar. And if you take the overall duration of that workout, 50 to 70% of it, your arms will have to actually be static over your head. And this is something that poses a very unique type of limitation to your cardiovascular system, because most of the time when you are working or moving around in regular life, your arms are below your shoulder line, which means that your heart is not having to pump upwards against gravity. So having the load, or a big portion of the load, actually being above your heart is one of the reasons that this is such a big limitation for people. Now, there's not a huge amount of research in the strength and conditioning world to be able to explain why this happens or what the actual load on the cardiac system is, because there's not really a lot of sports in general that require it. It is very unique to CrossFit and what has evolved from CrossFit in the mixed modal space. So one of the major reasons is just having your arms overhead for really long periods of time. Outside of that, your scapula and shoulder function is super important. So anytime you go overhead, if your scapula doesn't move appropriately, you have to create compensations within your spine. And when you do that, you're not able to breathe appropriately. So not only does it put stress on the actual central systems, having stress on the mechanical system in such a difficult position for most people to get in puts stress on your ability to actually use your energy systems appropriately, because you're put into an awkward position to compensate to get the barbell into a specific place or to just have your hands overhead. From there, we also have grip strength and endurance being a big thing. A lot of these workouts will require you to hang on to a dumbbell or a bar or be open-handed and pressing and actually having to have tension in your hands for the entire duration of the workout, where most endurance activities don't really require your hands to have to work that hard. Even a rower or a skier both require you to hang on to something, but the force per contraction is relatively low, and there's a recovery cycle in every rep. So you pull with your arms in a rower, but then there's a recovery cycle where you can kind of relax your hands and let them go back in before you start with your next cycle. If you're hanging on to a barbell or a dumbbell, there might be a very, very, very small amount of time where you can semi-relax your hands, but if you let go of it, it's gonna drop and it's gonna fall on you, it's gonna hit your head. So you have to actually use your gripping muscles for almost the entire durations of these workouts, which is very unique and oftentimes limits people. Like, no matter how good your Metcon system is at breathing and suffering and sweating for a long period of time, if your hands can't hang on to anything anymore, you're going to get crushed and have to slow down. So that is our third point, and like what limits people in these types of workouts. The other thing about this is it requires, like I said, you gripping for a really long time, which is a isometric contraction. And when you're doing an isometric contraction, it means you're basically flexing your muscle, but you're not moving. A concentric action would be, okay, I'm pulling my bicep and I'm actually shortening the muscle. An eccentric contraction would be, okay, I'm opening my bicep and I'm going to lengthen the muscle under load. An isometric contraction, you're not moving, but there's tension within your arm. So I'm flexing my arm on both sides and I'm having to maintain that tension for a really long period of time. There is no contraction relaxation cycle that allows your blood to pump without having to be in a very high pressure environment. So these workouts, because you're gripping for really long periods of time or statically holding your body weight upside down if you're inverted or holding a barbell overhead, have very, very, very high isometric loads, which puts more stress on the heart to have to pump against a high pressure system inside because your muscles are tense and can't relax because they're having to hold on. And the final thing is that this puts an enormous amount of stress on your core. So when you're in these positions with your arms overhead, you're basically in a hollow body hold position. Like obviously in this one, you're standing on your feet. In this one, you're hanging, but your body is completely elongated and you're having to stabilize your midline and go through a bunch of movement or stabilize so that you don't get a lot of movement, you don't lose the barbell. As a result of this, your core muscles have to work to stabilize you, but your breathing muscles are also in your core. So you're having to actually stabilize your spine at a very high degree and you're having to breathe at a very fast pace. So your core is having to play like double duty in these types of workouts, and it oftentimes will become a limitation for people. Will they have to put the bar down, put their hands on their knees, calm their midline, their backs blow up. So there is so many different types of limitations that get exposed with this specific pairing when you combine them together. So hopefully this gives you enough of an understanding and a reason to say, okay, this has to be something that I focus on if I want to be good at the sport. It's tested all the time, and there are so many different types of limitations that can get exposed. And if you don't train them, you oftentimes will just get crushed on the leaderboard. So hopefully that's a reason why you should be training it. Now let's talk about what a progressive model of training might look like to train all of these different limitations that come up when you're doing push-pull workouts. When I'm writing training, this is kind of the framework that I use. Is first I think about training movement. Once the movement quality is good enough, I start thinking about building strength in those specific patterns. And then once that strength is up to a requisite level, I start to think about conditioning and in a sports-specific way. CrossFit might teach this same type of concept as thinking of this as mechanics, and this as consistency, and this as intensity. Any of those kind of frameworks of thinking you can apply. For me, I think movement, strength, endurance. So that's kind of how I'm going to teach you in this kind of progressive format. So first things first is you have to address these kind of scapular shoulder function and core strength and endurance mobility things that are going to put you in better positions when you do these types of workouts. Most people, if you're not coming from a sport background or you're not super genetically gifted or you don't have great natural movement, will not have great overhead mechanics. They'll often look like this, where if you test their overhead position and you just say, hey, keep your midline brace and pull your hands overhead, they'll get to like here. But you know the standard in the sport requires you to get the barbell straight over your head. So because they don't have the range of motion in their scapula and shoulder, what they end up doing is bending and arching their spine and getting excessive motion in their lumbar spine and overextending to put their arms overhead. That puts your rib cage in a flared position and makes it really hard to exhale and have proper breath. It puts your shoulder in a sketchy position and can make you at higher risk for labral injuries and other types of overuse injuries in your elbows or shoulder, or your posterior shoulder cuff. So the first thing that I try to do is make sure that people's positioning is dialed in and they're much more stacked overhead, where you can actually maintain a neutral rib cage position, but get your arms overhead. This, even though it's an overhead motion will also just mean that your scapula is functioning and moving more properly, and it will transfer into also horizontal pressing as well. Because if your scapula is stuck and locked in and has tight range of motion overhead, it also probably is not functioning well enough when you're actually doing horizontal pressing like burpees. So this is the boring stuff that people don't normally like to do. It's generally done much more in the off season, much more in the process of building athletes to the point that they can start training intensely. But it would look like just high volume passive hangs, long isometric. So basically something like hang on the bar for a minute, rest for 30 seconds, then hold a barbell at 95 pounds overhead for a minute, rest for 30 seconds, and go back and forth doing intervals like that. That is a kind of a strength training session, but it's oriented towards movement and helping the shoulder function a little bit better in these ranges of motion before you're adding dynamic load or heavy loads to the system. You can also do just general stretching. You're going to have to put a lot of time in to open these ranges of motion, but any sort of general stretching or kind of accessory work like bottoms up kettlebells. So after we attack this kind of movement thing, we kind of get a green light check. Doesn't need to be perfect, but it also shouldn't be a red flag where you might get injured or be in horribly compensatory patterns. Once we kind of feel confident with that, this is where most CrossFitters who are competing are. They've already dialed this in. They feel good enough. So they move on and we start actually strength training in these positions and these pairings. The first thing I do in this strength training format is make sure that we dial all the skill in. Technique, timing, coordination, any KPIs for each of these movements. So you need to be able to swing on the rings well and do normal burpees and know your footwork on burpees and be able to kick up and do 25 feet of handstand walking and just feel confident and stable in the push and pull being separately good and up to a certain standard. When that feels good, we start to progress into strength training in these realms. So things like farmer's carries and weighted pull-ups are going to be the strength development of the pull side of the equation. And things like a 1RM strict press or a 1RM bench press are going to be our strength correlates for building the amount of strength you need in the pressing capabilities. And I think up until this point, most CrossFitters, if they're training and competing, they have this part taken care of. They've done the movement work, they've gotten the skill pretty good, they've gotten the general strength requirements up to the point that they can do the movements, and they've then started to do strength endurance of those movements. So they might have their PRs for what's max rep strict handstand push-ups, or what's max rep chest to bar pull-ups, or muscle-ups, or toes to bar, or any of the movements that fall into this push-pull category. So this would be the general training model. First movement, then strength, get it up to a certain level. And now this is where the fun begins for most CrossFitters. You need to actually start getting better at the sport, and specifically the sport combination of pairing both pushes and pulls together in workouts. Because remember, it's 40% of the total testing body. So it means that your workouts, when you get ready for competition settings, whether they're intervals, AMRAPs, for times, every 2 minutes on the, for 5 sets, every minute on the minute for 10 minutes, any of those formats, the key when you are trying to train this stimulus is pairing them together, because you've already worked on some of the limitations from doing this lower intensity work, but now you have to actually expose the limitations of what happens when you pair them together and take them close to failure. So there's really no substitute for just doing the thing at that point and actually pairing them together. And that's the mistake I think most people make. They do so much constantly varied Metcon work when they're getting ready for the Open or getting ready for a quarterfinals, but they don't actually think about, well, what are the pairs of movements that often come out that are going to expose things that are going to crush me on the leaderboard? And this one is one of the ones that they're basically missing oftentimes. So what you would do is basically just very simply look at all the push movements that come out. So handstand push-up, wall walk, burpee, handstand walk, shoulder to overhead. We look at all the pulling movements that come out. Toes to bar, chest to bar muscle up, dumbbell snatch and clean and jerk, rope climb. And we make sure that we pair those together in volumes that allow people to continually go back and forth and cycle through those movements. Now, for a beginner athlete, it might have to be smaller reps and smaller sets. And for an advanced athlete, it might be 15 minutes continuous back and forth with the set sizes getting bigger to put extra pressure on these muscular and central limitations that get exposed with that. Now, in our programs, right now, as we're getting ready for the competitive season in the Compete program, we're using an anchor test of 24.3 from quarterfinals. So this workout was 3 rounds of 10 handstand push-ups and 20 toes to bar, immediately into 2 rounds of 10 strict handstand push-up and 5 rope climbs, immediately into 1 round for time of 10 wall-facing handstand push-ups and 20 muscle-ups. The reason why we picked this as an anchor test is because it basically has as many of the push-pull movements all in one combination. So if we're gonna pick one test to try to anchor our progress to, this one is good because it doesn't then leave us exposed. If we prioritized just handstand push-ups and just toes to bar, and then Dave Castro comes out, he writes a workout and it's burpees, handstand walks, and bar muscle-ups, and we didn't touch those movements, our athletes would potentially be underprepared by just not have done the movements. So when we picked our anchor test, we picked an anchor test that had all of those movements together so that we can train the push-pull combo basically to the nth degree. So that is our test-retest of our current cycle that we're working on. But then throughout the course of the actual training week, we have about 40% of the overall training volume, so 2 days out of 5, dedicated to this specific pattern. On a Tuesday, we'll do a bunch of strength work and strength endurance work kind of in this side of the equation where they're building volume. And then on one day of the week, we're doing push-pull training specifically to test-retest this specific combination. So if you are out there and you are trying to crush the open or crush a qualifier, this is a type of workout that you should pay a lot of attention to. You could theoretically come to a qualifier. Maybe Dave Castro watches this video and decides, I'm never putting this in there to get them exposed. But the reality is the movements that you see inside the box are oftentimes going to challenge your upper body to push and pull together in workouts. So make sure that you pair them together, especially as you are getting close to competition, to expose some of these limitations that we've talked about and raise your overall ceiling. If you get your Metcons good, you get your Olympic lifting good, you get all your machines better, but you neglect this type of test, you could have tons of fitness that gets blocked by just having grip limitations in this pairing. Or you have tons of fitness, but when you hold your arms overhead, you can't breathe, so you get excessively gassed in this type of pairing. And in a testing format where you only have 3 to 5 tests, if 1 to 2 of them are going to test this limitation and you didn't train it, you're basically giving away like half of your overall points by just not having prepared correctly. So make sure that you apply this information, take this model of building your overall movement, building the strength. This is probably going to happen more in the off season. And as we get closer to the season like we are right now, make sure that in your conditioning, you're dedicating a lot of time to this push-pull pattern. Go out there, good luck, don't get exposed this year, and crush it. And if you're watching this video when it comes out and you want to join us in training in this quarterfinal 24.3 anchor test to make sure your push-pull is good and ready for the season, join us in our upcoming Ultimate Cycle starting November 10th.